Thank you to everybody for the love. This is the Time Talks podcast, where the music is always by awareness. We talk about history, politics, and art with the anarchist and anti-authoritarian perspective. This week I spoke to Gregg Deal, who is a contemporary artist. He does spoken word, performance art, and is a painter as well. He uses many mediums. His work speaks on many issues. He speaks about his experience as a Pyramid Lake Paiute, indigenous existence as resistance, and decolonization. I first saw Gregg's work at the Defiant to Your Gods exhibit he did at the Denver Art Museum. He called out racist stereotypes for what they were in a way that educated and really made people think on the normalized violence and colonialism they lived in. Today we spoke about the Doctrine of Discovery, boarding schools, the education system, the Change the Name campaign for Washington's racist football team name, his work and controversy at the Smithsonian, voter suppression of the indigenous community in North Dakota, and his friendship and work with the late artist James Luna. Hey, Greg.
What's going on, man?
Well, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
I used to be a teacher at Community College of Denver, and I'd always make the students not just read the state textbook, but the Indigenous People's History by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And I would always try to get students to actually try to decolonize the political science that I would teach, or history. And I really felt like that's one asset of the contemporary art that you do. So I'm really inspired by your art, and I use it in the classroom as well.
Well, I appreciate that, man. Yeah, I mean, the narratives that Native people carry with them is, it's a different bag, man. It's a different situation, the way that we live and the narratives that are in our homes, because it doesn't really align with popular culture or popular belief of American history. American history is taught from one perspective and only from one perspective, and that's not something we do in our home. Most natives I know, that's not how they roll.
And I was born in Aurora, but I'm from Denver, and I always get the students to acknowledge that every inch of America's indigenous territory, and that I get them to know that their school is on the homelands of occupied Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute land as well. I wanted to start with the first question of, we just passed this nationalistic, racist federal holiday, Columbus Day, that will hopefully one day be known federally as Indigenous Peoples Day. But I want to start with the Doctrine of Discovery, which was the largest real estate scam in world history. Columbus came over on his genocidal lost trip. And you have a piece that has a spray can that says Doctrine of Discovery with the word colonialism. Can you speak on this piece?
Yeah. There's all these things that sort of exist in plain sight when it comes to history and in this very specific case with Columbus and all of those who would follow him under the flag of colonialism. This is always such an interesting conversation because the American understanding of somebody like Columbus is steeped in myth and legend. I have a friend who's up at Notre Dame this last week, and he sent me photographs of these huge murals in one of the university's main areas. The murals are of Columbus, and they're specifically about Columbus. And the Indians that are around them are in plain style headdresses. There's a buffalo in one of them. And so there's this constant perpetuation of myth. And that myth is wholeheartedly romantic and also so misplaced that I think your average American is given just a tiny bit of information that is true enough to sort of justify it, and then everything else runs amok. And while that happens, there's no context. And so having a conversation about something like, Columbus Day and why that might be inappropriate lacks the basic understanding and basic context of Columbus to the United States, which is to say that there is none. He never set foot on this mainland. He was never a part of the sort of progress of the West settling North America. And so the other thing that is a huge part of that is this sort of benevolence that Columbus had in coming across the waters to, under this flag of discovery and expanding our world and everything else. That's all false. He was looking for a shortcut to India, specifically to make money for the royals that he was working for. And it was simply about money, and it was about that from start to finish. And, Columbus is, there's some interesting things about him, one of which being that he kept journals. He kept very well documented journals written by his own hand. So we know exactly what he did. We know exactly what his intentions were. And so there's nothing sort of mixed within that minces anything except the fact that he was coming for money, and he was coming by any means necessary to obtain those riches and to return them back. The Catholic Church, the way that ties in is really very significantly about a ruling power structure in Europe. And I always say that natives or the idea of tribes or tribal people is not exclusive to North America or South America or Central America, but that all human beings at one point were tribal people. And in Europe, the thing that demolished the tribal dynamic was monarchies and religion. And monarchies, of course, worked hand in hand with religion. And the Catholic Church was one of the largest perpetrators of fear, using fear as a tool to take and to control the masses. So when travel began to expand into the Western Hemisphere, these statements like the Doctrine of Discovery were created as a justification to take. There's strange language that's sort of about like the benevolence of believers of Christ, but there were a lot of loopholes that were created during that time. But all of it was a justification of taking things from people who were not Christ believers, and more specifically, not white. And I use that in very general terms. People from Europe are very fair-skinned, so that's the language that I speak in. But of course, there's different variations of that, particularly around the Mediterranean. But regardless, the entire purpose of the Doctrine of Discovery was about the justification of taking. You can kill somebody if they're not a believer in Christ. You can take things from them because they don't know any better. They're less than human. They are not civilized. They are not connected in the same way that Europeans are, which is really just an issue of differences in community and worldviews, and deciding that one is supreme over another.
They had used that dehumanizing term of calling heathens anyone who wasn't a Christian.
Right.
And that as well, like what you're speaking on.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your Indigenous in Plain Sight TED Talk, where not only do you show your son as a professional leaner, that part was awesome. You speak about visibility in the dominant culture and how white supremacists and imperialist colonialism creates a hierarchy and omits indigenous history, stories, which erases a people, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak about boarding schools like the Carlisle School, and you spoke about the Stewart Indian School, where some of these went up into the 2000s, and your haunting painting of the boy who had bloody knees and bloody elbows?
Yeah. Well, I think you almost have to take a step back. In that talk, there's a conversation, or there's some statements that I make about the context that Americans have, the context in which indigenous people have been framed, which is that there's like this cowboy and Indian narrative, that Indians wear headdresses, that we are the vanishing race, that we no longer exist, that we speak in pidgin English, that we're primitive, archaic, and a group of people that frankly no longer exists. What little bit of existence that we're allotted within American culture or Western culture at large is all based on a series of stereotypes that are not defined or informed by indigenous people, but instead are informed by this popular notion of our existence. There's been a significant effort to frame indigenous people within the viewpoint of colonialism, which is to say that we're given worth through colonial eyes, and our worth is obviously going to be different to an oppressive force than it is to ourselves. And that worth essentially is there to validate American history. So I don't know about you, when I was in high school and you take American history, you learn that Columbus came here, but you don't learn the name of the people that he came into contact with. When Columbus landed on the Western Hemisphere, he landed in what is now, the Dominican Republic. The Taino people were the people he came into contact with, having never set foot on the mainland. In fact, he died believing that he found a shorter route to India. But what ends up happening is, like, when you learn about that in school, you don't learn that the name of those people. And so the importance is immediately given to Columbus because he's the great benevolent discoverer. Then Indians will pop up around Thanksgiving, which is a story that is incomplete. It's usually taught incomplete. And what happens is that there's this myth of Indians sitting around a table with a group of Puritans and who were in the Americas specifically to escape religious persecution. And they all sit around the table, again, benevolently, to break bread and to have this group of people welcome them, and to not just welcome them, but to validate their existence on these lands. And then we get in, history. We get into, the Revolutionary War. We get into the Boston Tea Party, which doesn't have Indians, but it has some white dudes dressed as Indians that show up for a minute. And then we almost immediately get into Manifest Destiny, which is the expansion west, which begets troubles with the Plains Indians. And so the Plains Indian Wars ends up being sort of the pinnacle, historically, the pinnacle of interaction between this relic people and the United States. This is right after the Civil War, so everybody's still dressed like, Northern in blue, and Northern Union troops in blue, and they are part of this expansion as they're setting up forts in various places farther west, and which of course is all part of like the Louisiana Purchase and Thomas Jefferson's Indian removal. Andrew Jackson's Indian removal, not Thomas Jefferson. And I don't know why I always get those two mixed up, but I do. And so this pinnacle in history is, and you can go back to the Doctrine and Discovery on this. This pinnacle of history is about the expansion west, which, by all intents and purposes, is believed to be divine, ordained by God for white Europeans to expand the country into this great country that we know. And so the Plains Indians ends up as this sort of climax of interaction, ends up playing a role in the early stereotypes that began during that time frame. So like the captive, for example, which is something that's still perpetuated today within novels and things. That is the idea that Native women are kidnapped and taken to a tribe, possibly raped, and then absorbed into the tribe to become one of the people, only to be discovered later on by her own people and rescued, and for her to have this great tale of captivity and having been able to be adopted by the tribe. People don't realize that concept of like adoption plays a huge role in the misconception of the interactions natives had with non-natives. The cowboy and Indian narrative is completely made up, it's completely contrived, first in paintings and then in literature, and then ultimately, gaining its full force within film, and telling these stories that are not true about the interaction between cowboys and Indians. Those two things are completely separated. Indians are absolutely part of this myth-making process of justifying existence through fighting and excitement, which is a different way to justify things, I think. But the fact is that without the cowboy and Indian narrative, well, the settling or the taming of the West would be a lot less exciting. And so these are all the things that people have as context. And then when you get into film, you get into the ideas of like the Lone Ranger and Tonto, Tonto being a Spanish word for stupid. And then you get into Boy Scouts. You have like over 100 years of perpetuating myths of indigenous justification of the existence of Boy Scouts. And what's incredible about that is while these young boys are wearing headdresses and speaking in pidgin English and doing their Arrow of Light ceremonies and everything else, real Native children were being forced into boarding schools. The first boarding school opened in 1897? No, I think 1879. And they ran under the mantra of kill the Indian, save the man. And the whole purpose of it was to indoctrinate young children with Western culture and to strip from them everything that was familiar to them as indigenous people. So they would have to abandon their names and take upon them a Christian name. You can't see me, I'm using air quotes. And they had to speak English. They had to abandon their clothes, their garbs, to wear Western clothes, which I imagine, a lot of stuff's made from wool. I imagine it's probably pretty itchy for the first time you're wearing that. And they were forced to cut their hair. The boys and the girls were forced to cut their hair, and they were heavily and highly abused if there was any infractions on any of these things. So the Carlisle Indian School opened in Pennsylvania. So what happened is you go to these Indian communities and you're literally taking forcibly or manipulatively taking children to this school thousands of miles away from anything that's familiar. And they essentially exist in these schools. The Carlisle Indian School is interesting because there's a lot of, this is the first major boarding school. There's like not much accountability. I found out recently that there's a grave site there of children who died in the boarding school. 13 of them are listed as unknown on the headstone. Like, how the hell does that happen, man? Yeah. And this is not uncommon. That's just one boarding school. There was a lot around the country. And I mentioned, Stewart Indian School, which is in Nevada, which is the school that my grandparents went to, and that my own mother was conceived in. And so that lack of understanding that people have to these histories, to these things that happen from the mid-1800s to the present, don't play a part in the narrative of the romantic concept of the Indian. And as a result of that, we have a country that is significantly misinformed enough to even understand a story like the boarding school story. It's so removed from the idea that we are a country that is based on freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to virtually do anything that we want to do, within the bounds of good taste and the law. But while these kids in Boy Scouts are pretending to be Indian, Native people are literally not allowed to wear headdresses and not allowed to conduct ceremony. I mean, think about that, man. It's like it's illegal to do any ceremonial aspects of your own culture or group, and yet these young white boys are allowed to pretend to be Indian and dress in garb that you are not allowed to dress in. Mm-hmm. And the Indian Religious Freedom Act, American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, so that's within my lifetime, was what lifted that the legality of indigenous ceremony and outfits. But up to that point, 1978, that wasn't that long ago, it was illegal to do any of those things. And so the value of our stories beyond the romance is really a hard sale, because Americans do not have any sort of context of what that even means. I mean, I've met a dude that asked me if I live in a teepee, and I am an American like anybody else. I happen to also be a citizen of my tribal nation, but I don't live in a teepee out in the middle of nowhere and wear buckskin and everything else. And we use those things for various things, but we live pretty much like everybody else. It seems weird that would be novel, but it's true.
Yeah, and that's where I'll put a link in of that painting you did of the bloody knees and the bloody elbows of the child.
Yeah, that story's a tough one.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful. So, I saw on your Instagram you had posted a picture of an assignment that your son had to do. I believe it was something about archaic Indians. That brings up these stereotypes we were just talking about, just really erasing this whole history of so many narratives, and not speaking about archaic Europeans or anything of this. When I was in school at DPS, I had to do these letter writings where I write from Columbus's boat, and then the teacher, we write on like paper bags from King Soopers in calligraphy, and then the teacher would wrinkle it up and burn the edges to make it look old. And we had to do this from the Mayflower too, and I had no idea what I was doing as a kid, reproducing this whole colonial narrative of hiding this violence of it.
Yeah.
So can you speak on countering these narratives? It's something I really see in your work is this dual power of not just resisting, but also creating and building, like educating and telling these narratives.
Yeah, it's so hard because a lot of this stuff, like everything that I've kind of talked about, it sort of exists in plain sight. And as a result, it's really difficult to talk to people, particularly white people tend to get really offended and upset about these things because you're really questioning the thing that they believe in. I mean, in America, like patriotism and even to a certain extent nationalism, of which I think is right now really close to patriotism. These are not just stories in a book that you learn. These are actually elements of defining the identity of what an American is, or what an American thinks that they are. So when I've questioned people who are, in the Boy Scout program, and I've questioned people that are in the Boy Scout program and have been very respectful about it, and had people get really upset with me on it. And I'm pretty good with diplomacy, in terms of how I talk to people. But I can't control the way that people react. And so when these things happen, with my kids, like that's awkward. You know, like it's so awkward. I gotta talk to a teacher. I have to have a discussion. So the thing you're referring to is my son Bear. He had an assignment, and he wrote on this little sculpture, this paper sculpture thing he made, the title that he was required to write, which was Archaic Indians. And I think that most people would look at it as a small thing, to use the word archaic. I was talking to my oldest daughter, and she was telling me, like, yeah, we're learning about ancient Greece. And what's interesting about the words is the definition of them. To say it's ancient is to simply say that it belonged to a very distant past, something that perhaps no longer exists. To be archaic is to be very old or old-fashioned, the synonyms of which being obsolete, out of date, outmoded, bygone, antiquated. These are the words that are used to describe indigenous people. It's immediately being dismissive of the entire existence. And like, this wasn't that long ago. 200 years is not that long. And so you can't look at a people, like natives that dress the way that natives did during that time frame, alongside a group of people that are wearing, slacks and a blazer and a button-up shirt, and shoes, cobbled shoes. Like, they exist in the same space. It's not archaic. It's just a strange choice of words, man. And I think that it unknowingly, in some cases, undermines the value of the existence of indigenous people. How do I have that conversation with the teacher without upsetting the teacher too much? There's other things that are way more in your face. There was a situation I was living in. I lived in D.C. for like 17 years before I moved to Colorado about 3 years ago. And my son, the same son, had an assignment where they were supposed to pick an Indian name. And it was part of, Thanksgiving was coming up. And so they were supposed to choose an Indian name. And that was a conversation that I definitely had to have, because, like, my son's middle name is in the language of our people. All my kids have middle names that are in the language of our people, that I gave them, that is part of their legal names, like their Social Security cards look nuts. But it's part of the language of our home. It's part of the language of their lives and their identity. And is being trivialized in this one moment of trying to choose an Indian name. And those conversations are so hard, and really all you can do is just hope that the person you're about to talk to is open and ready to understand that maybe they don't know everything, and that's okay, because I certainly don't know everything. But it's difficult having those conversations because they're not part of regular conversations that people have. And again, putting into question their own identity. And that's tough, man. And it, of course, it shows up in my work in terms of identity and taking things that are commonly believed and twisting them and turning them a little bit, something as simple as like a stereotype, and putting it up in such a way that people are forced to sort of think about it. I mean, we do talking points on news shows. We see those lists, and really those things go right by everybody because we see the same thing all the time, and it doesn't change anything, and you're not, like, visually, it's like text on a screen. And whereas everything's so politicized now that you can't even have a conversation about something from a moral perspective without immediately being labeled as a liberal or as a conservative. And so the conversations are becoming more difficult because of the way that we're framing ideas right out the gate. And so art and creating things within art, I think, gives a new perspective to things because you're offering visuals, you're offering an alternative way to look at something. which gets people to actually take a step back and think, and not necessarily, come out the gates guns a-blazing against those liberals or against those conservatives or whatever the hell, is happening.
Uh-huh. Well, my next question related to when you were living in D.C. Can you explain your work with the Change the Name campaign of the racial slur for a football team? And was it also true that the Smithsonian exhibit said if you mention the team, it would become too, quote, politically charged?
Yeah, man, this is kind of a long story, but I think it's really interesting in terms of like how, as an indigenous artist, as an indigenous person, I sometimes, we have to navigate the spaces that are wholeheartedly not indigenous. So I went to college in Northern Virginia. And I always had an opinion about the mascot debate. I formed those opinions in high school. And I started college a little later. I was 24 when I started college. And immediately, like, school newspaper put something out. There was an editorial there that was talking about the whiny, complaining Indians. And so I sent a response, and I was actually at the time president of the Native student group, and I sent a response, and it blew up into this whole thing. It was so contentious, and it brought so much onto me. And this is like early 2000s. It put so much pressure on me, and there was so much, like, I was getting hate mail and all this other stuff that I took a step back from it because I found it to be so overwhelming. And I felt so ill-equipped to deal with it. After college, and I worked for the Smithsonian for a little while. I worked for the National Museum of American Indians, which I was part of an all-Native group that worked on the ground floor the year that it opened, the inaugural year that it opened. And this all-Native group were in this museum, and we had to deal with the American public. I mean, so it opened in September 2004, and by April 2005, 1 million people had been through those doors. And the purpose of us was to be there to inform people, to answer questions, to tell stories, to even tell them where the bathroom is, or to do, even give like small tours and sort of help inform people in the spaces that they're in. And so we figured out very quickly that lack of context that I mentioned before informed a lot of the way that people would interact with us. We would hear about in a week what a Native person might hear in a lifetime on a racial spectrum. It was really, really, really difficult. Anything from people coming in, like one dude came in and he's like, he points to his wife and he says, where can I put my squaw? And, squaw is essentially, it means vagina, and not like a good, not the clinical version, more the version that starts with a C. And it was like these things where like people would touch your hair. They would tell you that, that you're Indian. There was one point where there was a group of us. There was a group of natives. We were all working, and it was at the end of the day, and there was like 5 of us talking in a circle. And this woman was so excited, so enamored with seeing a group of Indians talking that she didn't compute anything that was happening and came up and said, "What language are you guys speaking?" We were all speaking English, man. She was just so enamored. And so, those microaggressions don't look so micro when they happen on such a mass scale. And it was really, really tough. But during that time, we were all very much on board with the importance of changing the name of the Washington football team. And in fact, Suzanne Harjo, who's one of the main proponents in Washington, D.C., about changing the name, was, I think she was on the board for the National Museum of American Indians, and she had provided us all with buttons that were advocating for the changing of the name, of which we were all forced to remove. because I found out one of the major donors of that museum was actually associated with the Washington football team. But and so there's all this stuff that happened like leading up to that. And of course my own degree in the arts and the time that I've spent, I went to Italy with an indigenous performance artist named James Luna. That experience informed a lot of stuff I was doing. And when the recession hit, I quit after about a year, and I did freelance work in Washington, D.C. for several years as a designer. And then when the recession hit, everything went to crap. And so I started making art full time because while I was waiting to get a job, I figured I could make some artwork and I could hustle a painting and bring money in. And at that time, which was probably about 2008, 2009, we had 2 kids. My wife and I had 2 kids. And so, really scrambling to make ends meet. In 2013, April 2013, I started a performance piece, and it was called The Last American Indian on Earth. And the entire piece was based around this idea of being a living, breathing stereotype and taking that thing into public. Essentially, I wear a headdress and I had leggings and breechcloth and ribbon shirts and like a bone check, like everything that you would expect to see, sort of plain style. The catch was everything I was wearing, I bought over the counter. Like it was all made in China, like just like consumable stuff. But people don't know the difference between those things. And so I wore that, and as a Native person embodied that stereotype, and took a lot of photographs and did a lot of video to capture the way that people would interact with me. And in, I think, the end of the summer, 2013, and I'd been out for a little bit, and there's a Huffington Post article that came out, I think, in August about the whole thing, and I ended up on local News Channel 8, which their studios are in Alexandria, Virginia. And for those that don't know the DC area, it's kind of tri-state if DC was a state. So it's Southern Maryland, DC, and Northern Virginia. And so I went to this studio, and they wanted to talk about The Last American Indian on Earth, this performance piece. And I said, awesome. And I was not paying attention to anything. I've had these opinions about mascots and things, but hadn't really taken it to the forefront in quite a long time. And I show up at the studio, and I'm in the green room waiting, and there's a TV in there so I can actually see what they're doing live before I go on. And I suddenly notice, because they're showing B-roll of tailgating at FedEx Field, that it's opening day of the Washington Redskins. And I immediately called my wife, and I was just like, it's opening day. I'm like, oh, crap, like it's opening day. They're going to pull me into this conversation. What do we do? Because I know, especially in as rapid as fans are in the Washington, D.C. area, that if I was going to have an opinion, I needed to stick to my guns, and I needed to sort of accept that there was going to be some residual fallout from that. So I have an opinion, but I checked with my wife to make sure, like, are you down for this? Because this is what's going to probably happen. And she's like, do what you got to do. And my wife's always been really good about that. And so I get on there. He asks about the last American Indian on Earth. I answer his questions. And then he asks about the Washington football team. And the rest of the interview is only about the mascots. And he put me on the spot. And so I did that. And then that started steamrolling this idea that the last American Indian on Earth was somehow about the Washington football team, which it wasn't. But the two did correlate pretty well in terms of stereotype and identity and perception of those things by American eyes. And then from there, everything just kind of blew up. Rallies, speaking engagements, protests at FedEx Field. There was a huge one in 2014 in Minneapolis when the Washington football team was playing the Minnesota Vikings. 5,000 Indians showed up. I mean, it was huge, and I just happened to kind of be at the forefront of that. And I remember somebody actually saying something to me about like, oh, well, he's an opportunist and he's just going after this because it's relevant. Which is, I mean, it happens to be relevant, yeah, but it was not part of my plan. And I realized really quickly too that that it wasn't just about the moral implications of using a dictionary-defined racial slur for a football team. It also was about the fact that I was a father, and at sort of the apex of that whole movement, just before I moved from Washington, D.C., I had 2 kids in school, and this is a very real thing that we have to deal with. Like, we have a conversation in my house. My kids understand what's going on. They know what the deal is, but I have to coach them to not talk about it at school, even if it comes up in conversation, because other kids might give them a hard time. But the thing that I was most concerned about was the fact that a teacher might decide that their fandom is more important than them being an educator, and they might bully my child because they feel that way. And some people might like dismiss that as being sort of, as being a little, what is it, hyperbole, but it's not. It's a truth. I mean, I was bullied by teachers as a kid for being Native, and that stuff is very real. And so it's not relevant. It's actually the makeup of the vernacular of my household and the way that we have to navigate the world, particularly with my kids, because people are so rabid about being fans. And so, yeah, that's some pretty serious stuff. But what's interesting is the way that these different entities, within Washington, D.C., have to navigate these things. I had a friend that worked for one of the branches of government, and she was being bullied by her other coworkers over this issue. So when the season would start, they would decorate her cubicle with Washington football team gear. She's a Native woman, and they are like inundating her cubicle with this stuff. And so this again goes back to context. Americans don't have context to this even being a racial issue, let alone an issue that would merit a conversation nationally, local, or otherwise. And so those things kind of overflow into different areas. So, hold on, I get a drink real quick. So, in 2016, I'm in Colorado by this point, and I had finished my residency at the Denver Art Museum, and I got a call from a curator at the Smithsonian. They were doing a group show, and they had a huge grant from the Ford Foundation, and they wanted to support essentially what was like a massive pop-up. It was multicultural. I mean, it was like 40-plus artists. Of those artists, maybe 2 were white. So it was like people from all over the world, different identities, different cultures, ideas and backgrounds. And it was going to be incredible because something like this had never been done before. What ended up happening is the upper echelon of the Smithsonian, the Office of Public Affairs, or the Provost Office, they were really concerned about this. And I'm sure they would deny it. I think it had a lot to do with a group of, brown and Asian artists, getting together to make stuff. And so they insisted that the curator present to this group who are essentially over the branding of the Smithsonian. And if you don't know how the Smithsonian works, there's different museums. So there's like the National Museum of American Indians, there's the Air and Space Museum, there's the National Gallery of Art, there's, all these different entities. They have their own directors, they have their own curators, their own staff, their own everything. They are under the umbrella of the Smithsonian. So that upper echelon is about making sure that each one of these separate museums and entities is creating content and things that fall in line with the overall mission and branding of the Smithsonian. So this group wanted to see all of the artists and wanted to see what work they've done and what they had proposed to do. This poor curator has to scramble and get all this together and presents all of the work. And 40 plus artists, they had a problem with 2 artists. They had a problem with my work, and they had a problem with a Muslim artist and who's a performance artist. And she, her name is Anita Ali, and she's Muslim, and she does these performance pieces that at the time was the red chador. She'd wear a full sort of Muslim covering, but it was in red sequins, and it had like a train, like a wedding dress, and so it was sort of characterized. But you got to remember, this is 2016. There's these presidential candidates that are like creating a lot of volatile discussions around Muslims, you know, on the right, and so they immediately saw her and they were scared to death of her and what she was going to say, and so they ultimately landed on allowing her to participate only if she doesn't speak, period. And they put that crap in writing. It was in her contract. And so the other person was me. I think she got it way worse than I did, if I'm to be perfectly honest, because it was just some crazy stuff. But so for me, I have no idea what the problem was. They saw the last American Indian on Earth and some of the photos from that. And the curator told me that there was an audible gasp in the room when they saw it. And all I can sort of surmise is that they saw something with a limited understanding of what appropriation is, and immediately like wanted to check all of it. So what they did is they said that in order for me to participate, that I had to take my work to the National Museum of American Indians, to the director, who still is Kevin Gover, and that he needed to check my work to make sure that it was, and this is their language, appropriate and appropriately indigenous. They wanted to have my basically card checked to make sure that I was a real Indian, and that they wanted to make sure that I had authority to even speak of these things in this way. And then they added, and this was not part of my original pitch, because my original pitch was a teepee filled with IKEA furniture. Like that was the whole idea. It was about like modern living, you know, and something that I thought would be fun, but also poignant in terms of like looking at like modern indigenous people. And so they had thrown in that I couldn't talk about the Washington football team, that I simply couldn't talk about it. I couldn't include it. I couldn't have any of the logo. I couldn't even use the term Redskin. And so that was not in my original pitch, but as is the case for me, usually if you tell me I can't do something, I'm going to probably figure out a way to do it. And so that's what it came down to. And it was really difficult to navigate. It was really mystifying, because I didn't bring anything to the table that was about pushing buttons. I've done that before. Absolutely have done that before. But for this one, I was looking to participate in this exhibit as a contemporary artist. And it ended up turning into something else, which I'm still very proud of. Was not what I ended up with. It ended up having to be a gigantic answer to the way in which they were censoring my work, and policing my work. And I asked them very specifically, I was like, hey, you know, like you're making me go to the National Museum of American Indian to sort of like justify my existence as an artist. Are you doing the same thing to black artists? Do they have to go to the African American History Museum? What about Jews? Do they have to go to the Holocaust Museum? Or white people, do they have to go to the American History Museum? And of course the answer is no. So it ends up looking like some pretty serious censorship. The reason why they immediately brought in the Washington football team, and donors maybe, I don't know what specific reason they have to that. But I do know that it's pretty suspect, as somebody who's at the forefront of that conversation for several years, to suddenly be told that I'm not allowed to talk about this thing that is very specifically part of my experience as being an indigenous person, particularly an indigenous person living in Washington, D.C. But the story gets better. What happened is when all this happened, I called a friend who works at the Huffington Post, and she's up in New York, and I said, hey, you got to get down here because this is crazy. And so she wrote a whole piece about it. The Smithsonian, like that provost office, they got super pissed and defensive about it. A lot of people, and you have to remember the Smithsonian is part of the federal government. Half of their monies go to pay staff and everything comes from the federal government. The other half of their monies come from donors that pay for exhibits and things to go up. But the Smithsonian is a power structure. It's a power structure that is led and regulated by the federal government. And so there's a lot of people that believe that everything that was happening was wrong, but if they work for the Smithsonian, they can't really say anything about it because their job would be in question or they would be harassed. And so there's all these big issues that go into this. So I end up sort of being lone man standing, or Anita and I end up being like lone artists standing amidst all this crap. And when it ended, and it was called Cross Lines, a culture lab in intersectionality. And there was a point, because Anita was like at the apex of this exhibition in her placement, and she was surrounded by American flags wearing this covering while not being allowed to, speak to anybody. And there was a point where the two of us decided that we were going to intersect, and we stood on her stage surrounded by American flags for about 5 minutes or so. And we still, to this day, we call it a collaboration. We called it Existence as Protest, and we were intersecting, and we got in trouble for that. Because that upper echelon of the Smithsonian had told the director of the group we were working with in the Smithsonian for the show that if the two of us stepped out of line, that they would lose their jobs. So they're freaking out. And then, of course, we're, causing trouble. I mean, I don't really want to use that term because it doesn't really fit. But the problem is that if we are in breach of our contract, it's going to put Anita and I in a lot of trouble as well. And so there was all this stuff to navigate, and it was really stressful, and it was kind of upsetting as well. But what ended up happening is when everything was done and this article came out in the Huffington Post, it turned into this big thing. So that upper echelon of the Smithsonian, back up just briefly for some context. The Smithsonian, oftentimes when they have special people come in, they'll do these all hands meetings for anybody who's an employee with the Smithsonian before the Smithsonian opens, which is usually about 10 o'clock. And so you can go and you can sit, you can hear these curators talk or these artists talk, or they have panel discussions on some exciting new exhibit that's coming up. It's like all this internal stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so they put together one of those. It was a panel, and it was specifically moderated by this dude who's on, in the provost office. And he brought in a Native American curator and a couple of other curators to discuss language and words and how we navigate all these things. And it was specifically in response to this article. And what was crazy is for all the publications for this, I had a friend in the Smithsonian who was sending me all this so I could see everything that was happening. They were using the Washington Redskins logo. They were using the words. They had a whole discussion about the word Redskin. And it was like this huge counter to like, hey, we wouldn't let this Indian artist use this word, but we're going to discuss it ad nauseum. And it was just completely bonkers, man, the way that it all went down. But I think, in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian is a power structure. So is the Washington football team. It's a huge, huge money draw for the Washington, D.C. area. And I think the fourth most popular sports franchise in the world. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. That was a really long story, man. Sorry.
No, that was awesome. It was really ridiculous and interesting as well, and an important story to to know. And when you were talking about the last American on Earth with the documentary that you put together, not the one that was taken, right, by Dakota.
Yeah.
You say this is what dehumanization looks like. When the two women were talking to you, you talk about the commodification of the Indian image, and one profound thing you said was the performance piece wasn't really you performing, but everyone else. And it really sounds like the Smithsonian was performing as well.
I mean, the interactions that we as indigenous people have to have in the world that we live in is, it's real, man, you know, and I saw a tweet the other day that just like totally stuck with me, that said something to the effect of like, you know, the worth of indigenous people as human beings is good when we're just looking for recognition and equality, and we're not looking for revenge. Because there's a whole lot of history that would denote, you know, grounds for revenge. But that's not what we're doing. And, you know, the same people that are going to church every Sunday and that are learning about teachings of Christ, turn the other cheek, you know, be a better person, are the same people that are telling us that we're whiny because we have these opinions. There's never been any reconciliation with indigenous people. And frankly, there's never been any reconciliation with black people after slavery and after Jim Crow. I mean, this is not part of the vernacular of American culture or even the American government. Things happen, and it's like, all right, you know, that's good. We recognize that. Let's move on. At no point is an apology given. At no point is there any reconciliation. At no point is there any grounds for discussion. And because that never happens, that means that the rest of the population of the United States and its history never have a discussion that ever helps justify or pull together the need to understand those stories, the need to understand why natives are trying to get these things changed, the reason why those things exist in popular culture at all, like the term redskin. It's so ingrained in our culture, our dehumanization, our identity, which is not informed by us. All of these things exist because they're so integrated into the power structure that is the United States, that is American culture, that is Western culture, that to give us a platform to be able to say, look, this is not appropriate or okay, doesn't exist. The things that happen with boarding schools, nobody knows about that because it's never been talked about, because it's never been informed, because there's never been anything reconciled. We're just barely finding out the lengths at which Jim Crow has affected the black population of, the Deep South and beyond. It's 2018, that was like how long ago? And we're just now figuring out the depths of those things, and that is because there has never been any reconciliation. And America has a really difficult time pulling itself together to reconcile anything.
Yeah, and even if you look at Canada, they did all the same things to First Nations with the boarding schools as well. They at least, lowest on the bar, did a truth and reconciliation study that admitted to cultural genocide, even though it should be genocide as well, should be acknowledged. But they at least did that, and that's still very low bar.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right. That's low-hanging fruit, and Canada's got a whole host of other issues in the way that they're dealing with Indigenous people. But I can honestly say that I do not believe that America would ever do something like that, because America would have to admit fault. Right now, there's the Indian Child Welfare Act is back up onto the scene, and people are like, oh, what's the big deal? It's a huge deal, and it's a huge deal because after World War II, there was a pretty intense discussion about the definition of genocide. There was a guy that talked specifically about genocide. A Jewish gentleman who lost most of his family in the Holocaust, who was in camps, and he essentially wanted to have this definition in popular understanding, in international understanding. The UN accepted it, and they literally defined what genocide is. And one of the definitions of genocide is taking a child from one group, putting it into the dominant group, and never giving them access to that group. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was created specifically to bridge that gap, because we are a marginalized group of people that have been in extremely difficult circumstances over the course of well, depending on which community you're talking about, but over 500 years, and that are dealing with existence and trying to maintain culture and language and all of these things. To blindly take an indigenous child and place them into a private adoption to a non-native home, or even a public adoption into a non-native home, without that being informed by the tribe that that child is connected to, is an act of genocide. Yeah. And what's crazy in Texas, where this whole thing is kind of blowing up again, this judge said that law is prejudice against white people. And I think he used non-native, but I mean, we all know what he's saying. And you're talking about, like, we're 2% of the population. You know, at the turn of the century, there was 250,000 natives in the United States. We've been able to bring that up to about 5 million. And the preservation of our people, of our culture, of our communities, of our languages, of our stories, of our identity, and to be able to have access to those things is so vastly important to the survival of our people. That is why the Indian Child Welfare Act was created, to take one of the tools that is used to eliminate, just like the boarding schools, cultural rights and practices from individuals, and making sure that they are connected to those things. You know, to forcibly transfer children of one group to another group, that is about breeding out indigenous people and not giving them the right to stay within, to, you know, have knowledge, to pass that knowledge on to their children. There's so many problems with that. But yeah, all of this is it's the Article 2 of the convention that defines genocide. It was created.
Lemkin came up with that term. Yeah.
Yeah, UN Convention on Genocide in December 1948, which was ratified in January 1951. So under international understanding, that act that the United States has been perpetuating for a long time is an act of genocide, and is, by an act of Congress, it's protected. Like, we're not, 1978, the same time that they did the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, they had created the Indian Child Welfare Act. And somebody is saying that it is prejudicial against somebody who belongs to the dominant society in this country. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills here, man. That's insane.
Yeah, it is. It's ridiculous. And it really ties into what's going on the border as well, with the children being separated.
Yeah, man, divide and conquer. That's been the way. That's been the way of things for a long time. And you know, a lot of people forget that pretty much like from Missouri, like St. Louis, Missouri, or most of Missouri, if I remember right, west of that whole area was Mexico territory. And the Mexico territory was ultimately stolen by the United States through a series of bullying and militaristic moves. But the borders that are the United States and Mexico, those are made up borders. Those borders exist, you know, after a whole number of different things happened, which means that people in Central America are indigenous, and those borders don't exist, and you can move freely between those two places. And when those borders are put up, you're disconnecting people from their own homelands, from their own rights within those homelands. for people who are deriving from white Europeans to say that Mexicans are illegal, man, they're indigenous. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Yeah, man, they have more of a right to be walking on across that border than any white European ever did. It's just, but it's all about perspective on this stuff.
Yeah, and I think these issues are so important to talk about. The Child Welfare Act, the voter suppression that's going on in North Dakota.
Yep.
And I've really been seeing Elizabeth Warren's strange DNA press conference taking precedent and really decentering indigenous issues and not giving, letting indigenous tell the story next to what's going on with that discussion.
Yeah, I think I said it on Twitter too, that giving a platform for this strange DNA discussion with Elizabeth Warren and ignoring the fact that there are Americans who are outwardly and openly being suppressed in their ability to vote in North Dakota. A law that was created that is suppressing almost exclusively indigenous people, which would be a swing vote in North Dakota. That's being ignored. I just barely started seeing something, I think, on CNN about it. But that stuff's being ignored, and a white lady, from Oklahoma who's in Massachusetts is being given more authority in this conversation than actual indigenous people, Americans who are being denied their right to vote through the additional red tape and hoops that they have to jump through just to be able to check a box. If that isn't a metaphor for how indigenous people are treated in this land, I don't know what is.
Well, my last two questions kind of tie together. So I want to talk about your relationship with James Luna, the late James Luna. He passed away in March. He said Americans like romance more than they like the truth. America likes to name military weapons and airplanes after our peoples. They like to name their film festivals and most sacred ceremonies. Then he ended it with America Doesn't Know Me. Can you talk about his influence with you in performance art, or how you two work together, and your really powerful performance art you did where you actually were talking about blood quantum and you had your ID number and your blood quantum. It was actually tatted on you during this at the Denver Art Museum.
Yeah. Well, I learned about James's work in college. I was studying his work because I was looking for indigenous artists that had these strong, native voices with their work. I don't know, I never really liked performance art. That was never part of my wheelhouse of skills. I took a performance art class in college, and it was pretty funny. It was super hokey. And when I worked at the Smithsonian, just out of school, it came up, James was going to the Venice Biennale. The Ford Foundation was funding it. The Smithsonian, the National Museum of American Indians, was supporting it. They had a couple of native curators that were helping to pull everything together. And the Ford Foundation insisted on this also benefiting, somebody who's coming up in the game. And I literally, because I didn't know, they didn't put a call out. I didn't have to fill out anything. I was quite literally in the right place at the right time. And they pulled me in, and they're like, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it." And next thing I know, because a year before, when I was in school, I had an Art Now class. I was studying about the Venice Biennale, which is, pretty much this who's who of contemporary artists in the world, with every country represented. So I had a class where we were learning about that, and then I had another class where I was learning about James's work. And a year later, I was at the Venice Biennale with James, and it was overwhelming. I was there for a couple weeks. I helped him out, was essentially like an assistant, I helped with some of the publications because I had enough graphic design background, so I kind of helped with a little bit of that. And then when they actually printed the book for his exhibition, I helped oversee that in Italy because they had to send it to a printers there to get everything done. Oh, wow. And I helped him, and it was awesome, and he was talking to me, and I spent a lot of time with him. And then the last couple of days, we were sitting around in a coffee shop, and everybody's drinking their espressos, and I said, I don't know how it came up, but I said something about, like, you know, I didn't know what I needed to bring, and people told me I just needed to prepare for everything, and I brought a suit, and I had like a pink tie. And James's eyes lit up, and he's like, "You should wear that tomorrow and be in the show." I was like, okay. He's like, "Here's what we'll do." He just wanted me to stand guard, like in his whole performance piece, and then he would take a break, and then I would go, and he would have me go and pick up like a little espresso and bring it back to him, and then he would sit and drink it in the middle of his performance, and we would just chat like we were chatting. And but I was like handing him stuff, and so he pulled me into the performance. There's just photographs of me in his performance, like wearing a suit and sunglasses, and it was just like this thing. But as simple as that was, that really, frankly, generous gesture that he gave me changed everything for me. It changed everything. And it changed my perspective. It changed like what indigenous art is, because James is pretty unconventional with the way he presents his indigeneity within his work. Like some of it's like, okay, yeah, like he's wearing a roach and he's got moccasins on, but he has these pieces that are taking the canon of indigenous existence and flipping it on its head, and it's amazing. And that's been a huge influence to me. And after that, I saw him again later on. He did his piece called "Take a Picture with a Real Indian." Oh, yeah. On Columbus Day in D.C. in front of a Columbus statue that's in front of Union Station. It's a big train station in D.C. And he did that, so I hooked up with him then. And then we started, like, we talked regularly, man. We talked probably once a month or once every couple of months for years. And he'd be like, "What are you doing?" And we would just talk. He was a mentor. He helped me along. And the last American Indian on Earth originally was supposed to be James. That I was going to direct it and sort of do everything around it, and he was going to do it. And he sent me these preliminary pictures. There's a picture of him wearing like California-style garb, the outfits that like his people, Luiseño, would wear, mowing a lawn. And I know that picture's out there, but that's the first. That came from this concept we were having about like taking something that is overtly Indian and having it existing in sort of modern day, everyday situations. And then he had back problems and he got back surgery, and so he wasn't able to do it. And I got impatient and decided I would just do it myself. And I went and did it, and it turned into this whole thing. Like the last American Indian on Earth is essentially what, you know, kind of put me on the map. And then that mentorship changed a little bit. And that we were talking more along the lines of being peers. So I had dinner with him last November, 2017, and we were talking about a collaboration and working together. And we had dinner with him and with one of his friends, a spoken word poet, Lukewarm Water, and we just hung out. And I talked to him because he died just after his birthday, like the month after his birthday. And I hit him up on his birthday to say happy birthday and everything. But yeah, we were talking about collaboration, and then everything, he passed in New Orleans. And I found myself in New Orleans a few months later and was kind of tripped out by that. Yeah. He's a good dude, man. He just opened my eyes to so much. And even more so at the fact that indigenous art is not this, it's not a painting of cowboys and Indians. Indigenous art, you know, is not And it doesn't have to be something that is defined by the Western buyer's market, that it can be whatever we want it to be. And he always said that performance art was so important because it created, it gave us control in real time as Native people. That oftentimes, you put a painting on a wall, somebody walks up, they, consider it or they don't, they walk away, and they never pull anything from that. But when you're doing performance art in real time, you are actually in control of the narrative that people see. And they can still bring their prejudices to the table, but you can also flip those things on a dime with what you do, with what you see. And he was so incredibly, I don't know how I'd put it, he'd have a plan, but he would also just move however the spirit moved him. He would move whatever he felt worked for that moment. And he would sort of channel an energy within those things that helped him pull those performance pieces together in a way that would inform them after the fact. It was really incredible the way that he would do things. But I love that idea that, like, as indigenous people, performance art gives us control in real time. And he was one of the pioneers for performance art for indigenous people. Absolutely one of the pioneers.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. I'm really grateful for your time, and thank you for the knowledge and the art that you share.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for listening. Please check out Gregg's work at greggdeal.com. It's Gregg with 2 G's. Buy his shirts, buy his prints. Support him if he comes to your city. Big shout out to Awareness for the music. Please rate, subscribe, and share the show.